stop button on that video. Just gotta push it inadvertently. So we are now going to have a part two, which is going to be pretty short and sweet. Um, so here, we start getting okay. First of all, this woman, yeah, just no, she is not the greatest economist. So she is not. Another false statement. She is not the best female economist of the 20th century. That honor goes to Joan Robinson, a British economist. Again, ideologically, she's a post Keynesian. She's against the sort of, neoclassical bent, neoclassicals that were bent, mainstream more accurately. Don't worry about the difference of the book. It's against, Joan Robbins is against that. A lot of people say she should have won a Nobel Prize. Uh, she was, a student of Keynes, and she was, against the capitalist system, and this woman is for the capitalist system. Says, "Oh, best female economist of the 20th century." I mean, that is so untrue. That's just total BS. That would definitely be Joan Robinson. She's just, doing this sort of standard neoliberal stuff. Uh, so false. Probably thinking that's subjective. It's not true or false, but in this case, it's just false. Joan Robinson contributed much more than her. I mean, there's stuff in your micro textbook. You get an imperfect competition. Yeah, Joan Robinson. A lot to do with that. Okay, standard of living. Okay, this is kind. I'm not going to talk a lot about this. I'm going to bring up this story. Everyone loves to say this. If there's an oil spill, then it increases expenditure because money has to be spent to clean up the oil spill, which increases income. So it increases GDP. So obviously, an oil spill is bad, but it's increasing GDP. Therefore, GDP cannot necessarily cannot be a good measure of the economy, um, of the standard of living or the economy. It cannot be a good measure of that because there's oil spill problem. Um, to save us all a lot of time, again, original research here. Uh, the problem is that it's about aggregated utility. We talked about utility theory value. It's about how much good people are getting out of the economy. I mean, all the new stuff, just because there's more, you know, spent in real dollars, doesn't necessarily mean there's more utility, at least because of things like oil spills. Yes, they increase expenditure, come income, but they don't increase utility. They've made us worse off. Same thing with anthropogenic global climate change. I was at a Laotian temple in Olathe, and I was talking to a guy there, and he's a lot younger. He's a lot younger than he looked, but he's pretty close to my age, and we're just like comparing notes. And he was saying when he lived in Los Angeles, I spent the second half of my childhood in Sacramento. It's like there's all these kind of magical places you could go off and be in. Well, they're just not there anymore. Yeah, I went back to Sacramento. Gentrification. I mean, GDP growth, gentrification, same thing really. Other so two sides of the same coin. Just all these magic places we're going. It's Chinese restaurant used to have locals in there reading the paper in Chinese. You know, uh, real authentic Chinese place. Where now it's this high end, Richie. This looks like any other kind of Americanized Chinese restaurant. Lost all of its character. You know, all over the place. I was finding that these little magic things. You know, you know how much your parents. It's all over the internet and stuff. Nostalgia for the '80s. Stranger Things and Cobra Kai. People who lived through the '80s like myself miss those times. Real GDP was a lot lower. Like I said, we had to roll down the windows to our car unless you were rich. A lot of us didn't. You didn't have air conditioning unless you were pretty rich. A lot of that kind of stuff. A lot of beat up cars and all this. But yeah, and there's still a lot of beautiful people around then too. I mean, there's just this certain magic in the air going outside and stuff that GDP just kills. It kills languages, it kills cultures, it kills animal species, it kills plant species, it kills landscape species. You know, it's usually the anthropogenic global climate change argument is like uh, in terms of GDP, period. Again, my research. And somebody got this in macroeconomics in the news assignment. I was very impressed. There are this person said non-price, but there's non-priced goods. And those aren't being measured. Like they throw them in, but they just count them as like, a percent of the damage, and then it reduces in value as income grows, even though it has nothing to do with it. And even though what we're losing is not mostly going to be replaced by GDP. So GDP has huge costs because utility, and the sum utility is welfare, because welfare is not being considered in terms of its actual value, but with this poor proxy of GDP, it's not measuring welfare. It's not counting all of these costs associated with it, So as a result, and it's not usually understood the way I explained it, the oil spill example is like all over the place. Like I said, I don't think you're going to get through a macro class without somebody bringing that up. But, as a result, now there's a little, in the textbook, let's go, should be here, right? Is that in this chapter? Yeah. Another student did a great job on macroeconomics in the news, but they were trying to tell me that this EKC thing was demonstrated by Costa Rica's high GDP yet environmentalism. I was really happy to see that kind of syllogistic logic, but that's actually not evidence of the EKC curve, which there is not really much evidence of outside of these local effects, because Costa Rica does not have a particularly high GDP. They're committed to the environment for their own reasons. The people want it that way. They were one of the few Central American countries to get away from American influence by just simply raising taxes, not trying to throw out the corporations. And they just left on their own. Okay, you can raise taxes. That didn't cause the CIA to come in and overthrow them. So, they don't have baseball either, like most other Central American, Caribbean nations. I once joked on a history exam that when I was supposed to say who Fidel Castro was, he's like this famous Cuban baseball player. My teacher got a big kick out of that. We're still friends. I'm actually going to see him when I get back to Sacto. But, not a high GDP. Still very, very green, because it's not about GDP growth bringing that about. It's about deciding to bring that about, bringing that about. So they have a relatively low GDP, but they're happy, right? Look up Kerala, K-E-R, let's see. Yeah, K-E-R, Kerala, state in India, very famous for having zero GDP growth and yet a very high standard of living for people. Health, education, empowerment. Same basic thing here in Costa Rica. It's about welfare, and welfare is a function of many things beyond GDP. And past a certain point, GDP really doesn't give you any more welfare. People, like, it may be higher now, but a while back, earning more than $50,000 a year does not make you any happier. So, also it's funny that he brought this up, which is great. I love that he did. This is awesome. But the one I'm the most familiar with is from another country called Bhutan. The gross happiness index. Okay, that's a big deal too. They don't have GDP. They have all these other measures of health and well-being and happiness. They do have some problems with the treatment of the Hindu portion of the population, but we're on the right track here. So these are very common. I believe it was actually Herman Daly that first came up with the idea of an alternative GDP. We read his paper at the beginning, or some of us did. Also, he was like the only economist I've seen who I sort of anticipated Well, two things. My critique of the capital mobility, or essentially his, at least, causing changes in capital mobility, causing wage changes in both countries, in addition to price changes instead of comparative advantage, and also in realizing that, although it wasn't in the context of anthropogenic global climate change, but in terms of environmentalism more generally, that there, is a microeconomic effect that the macroeconomists doing it have overlooked, in quotes, because I'm not sure how unintentional that was. There's a rising cost at the margin to GDP growth in terms of its environmental destruction, uh, and a falling marginal cost, as is consistent with microeconomics, to the value of GDP. That's partially included in at least the Nordhaus, probably the most famous IAM, which is an integrated assessment model, which is an economics climate model. Is he does have a falling rate of GDP at the margin, but he does not have any rising costs. And because he considers everything destroyed to be substitutable by GDP, then everything destroyed comes at a falling marginal cost, which is just like anti-microeconomics. Okay, so last but not least, is this even in here? I don't think he talks. I mean, he brings it up. I don't know. I'll just quickly say we need to say something about per capita GDP. I want you to understand this. Per capita GDP is the gross domestic product divided by the population. So it's GDP per person on average, the average GDP per person. Now, when populations increase, let's say you have the same amount of land and more people working the land, after a certain point, every person is going to be less productive than the one before him or her. So it's like more people, as you add more, they're producing less, but there's more mouths to feed, there's more to consume. So as population grows, it may increase GDP, but it will reduce per capita GDP. Okay, other things equal, and one of those other things that are equal being becoming variable is that if GDP increases in a country with a larger population, it may cause a population to reduce and increase GDP per capita, because women become empowered generally to make over their reproductive decisions, because overpopulation comes from men having that power, and it starts going away as incomes rise generally, and men too, when there's been, like, for example, in Iran and China, policies to limit fertility, which I think both countries have switched, and they won't go back again. The couples, I mean, the men don't like having a lot of kids around any more than the women do once they're used to it. And as incomes have risen, so as incomes rise, it may drive down population and increase per capita GDP. But if you start getting more people, like say, moving in, theoretically it reduces GDP, or at least its growth. Okay, so that's per capita GDP. That's pretty much the lecture here. As always, let me know if there's any questions. Okay, here endeth the lesson.